1655. Translation. Introduction. Picking up from Part 2. This is Part 3 of the English translation of Newe Welt and Americanische Historien, New World and American Histories, the great 1655 Frankfurt folio, compiled by Johann Ludwig Gottfried. Parts 1 and 2 translated the whole of Book 1, the natural philosophy, geography, peoples, religions, governments, and political histories of the Americas. That section ran from the cosmology of the Torrid Zone through the mines of Potosi, the temples of Huitzilopochtli, the Inca dynastic line, the fall of Tenochtitlan, and a complete territorial survey of every bishopric and province from Florida to Tierra del Fuego. Book 1 closed with a general account of the two populations of colonial India, the Spaniards who conduct themselves as nobles and never touch a plow, and the Indians who have accepted Catholic practice, but whose week-long drinking sessions are, as Gottfried notes, worse than the Germans. We now cross into Book 2, the Voyages, 33 accounts of European expeditions to the Americas from 1492 to the 1630s. This is where the book changes voice entirely. The encyclopedic catalog gives way to narrative. People do things. Ships sail into unknown water. First contacts happen. Men are terrified and brave and greedy and cruel in specific, named circumstances. Book 2 opens, as it must, with Christopher Columbus. A note on what lies between Part 2 and this text. The final pages of Book 1, printed pages 105 to 202, scanned pages 129 to 226, contain extended ethnographic descriptions of Brazil's Tupinambá people, drawing heavily on Hans Staden, whose full captivity account appears later in Book 2, the peoples of Florida and Virginia, New England, Guyana, and the Amazon. These pages continue the von Natur und Eigenschaft der Neuen Welt header and are part of Book 1's Natural and Human History section. They will be translated in a future supplementary volume. Part 3 begins at the opening of Book 2 proper, the title page of the Voyage accounts, at printed page 203. Chapter 2, Chapter 1. The First Voyage and Discovery of the New World, by Christopher Columbus of Genoa, in the year of Christ 1492. The highly renowned Christopher Columbus, born in the little town of Cucureo, in the Genoese territory, and by descent from the noble family of the Pellestrellas, from the city of Piacenza, in Liguria, a brave, learned, and in seamanship experienced man. After he had sailed inside the island of Cadiz in Spain and through all the limits of that sea, noticed repeatedly and paid close attention to the fact that certain winds blew toward the west at a fixed time of year, which blew for several days in a steady and equal blast. From this, he concluded that these winds could come from nowhere other than from a land that lay so far across the sea. He therefore turned this over his mind for so long until he had resolved within himself that he would at a certain time properly discover and explore this region. And so, when he was about 40 years old, he revealed his intention to the entire council of the Genoese at Genoa, offered his service, and promised solemnly that if only a few ships were adequately equipped and handed over to him, he would sail out beyond the Pillars of Hercules and not stop sailing toward the west until he came to the islands that were fertile with all manner of spices and aromatics. But they did not wish to offer him any help or assistance for his proposed undertaking, and scorned it as something incredible and impossible that he was attempting. Yet Columbus did not let himself be turned from his purpose, but continued to hope steadily that he would yet find some prince or lord who was powerful and also willing and well supplied enough to assist him with ships and other necessary things for his undertaking. For which reason, he further resolved to travel toward the west. When he came to Portugal, he sent his brother Bartholomeus to England to put his intention before King Henry VII, and to request help most humbly. But it was in vain. He returned from there with nothing accomplished to his brother. Columbus did not despair even so, but presented himself in like fashion to King Alfonso in Portugal. But the Portuguese, who held themselves for the most experienced sailors, despised and mocked Columbus and his proposal, said he was either crazy and foolish, or an imposturous, worthless vagabond. With which words they inclined the king, so that he refused him the help, and was unwilling to give credence to his proposal. Finally Columbus went in Castile to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, revealed to them equally his intention, brought plausible evidence and sound reasons, so that they were in part somewhat favorably disposed toward him. though it seemed outlandish and laughable to them at first. When he had been at court for 4 years and always remained steadfast in his opinion, he finally obtained, through the help and mediation of certain Spanish lords, a free audience with Queen Isabella, and thus got the opportunity to speak with her properly of his purpose. And he achieved so much that she promised to do what she could with the king, that nothing should be lacking that would serve and be necessary for the accomplishment of the proposed important matter. Therefore, through God's help first and foremost, and then through the Queen's intercession and mediation, Columbus's long-delayed resolution was finally put into action, and King Ferdinand gave him a large cargo ship, together with 2 other large ships, well supplied with war people, munitions, provisions, and all other necessary things, and in peace let him sail away. So much effort and work it cost before only the beginning of the discovery of the New World was made, so that one may well marvel at how some can be so shameless as not to wish to grant Columbus the honor that cost him so dearly. But he himself settled accounts with certain Spanish courtiers properly at a meal, when it came up for discussion. For when one of those at table began and said, "Lord Christopher, if you had not discovered India, there would yet have been found some in our kingdom of Spain who would have done it just as well as you, for Spain has just as many and as sharp-witted men who are experienced in the free arts, languages, and world description as the Italians." Columbus gave him no answer, but had him bring an egg, which he laid on the table, and said to all, "My dear lords, I will wager the whole meal whether any of you at table can stand this egg upright on the free table so that it stands on itself." As none of them could do it, though they tried, Columbus took it in his hand, knocked the egg tip slightly and carefully against the table, so that the shell cracked and bent inward, and then stood it upright, and it remained standing. Now that they had seen it, they could easily do the same after him. Thus, he said, after he had first found the new islands, they could now easily follow after him. With this they were quieted and gave themselves content. Therefore Christopher Columbus, together with his brother Bartholomeus, with happy heart and full of hope, sailed out of the harbor of Palos at the beginning of August 1492, with great joy onto the high sea, and after some months came into the island of Gomera, where he filled the barrels again with fresh water and took other necessary things with him. From there he sailed steadily in his begun voyage straight toward the setting sun. But when they had sailed roughly 30 days on the rough sea, uncertainly here and there, and no land had come into sight, nor could any indication of land be detected, the soldiers began to become unwilling and to mutter, threatened him openly with many offensive words, called him loudly a Genoese vagabond and deceiver, that under his leadership they had been driven into evident destruction and pushed to the threshold of death. In contrast, Columbus stilled and comforted them with friendly words, urging them not to be impatient, for he hoped and trusted, through God's help, that they would soon see before them the new unknown land. And so that he might keep them together, he promised them that if they did not sight land within 3 days he would turn back with them. It is quite believable that Columbus had perceived from the course of the heavens and other signs that they were not far from land. He also had a wondrous experience at this time, which made him cheerful and glad, so that he could so boldly encourage his people, in that he noticed from the sounding lead he had lowered into the sea, on which a shell had clung, that he was not far from a coast. Added to this that the winds no longer blew so steadily, which variation he deemed caused by nothing other than the wind blowing from the mainland and pushing back the wind on the sea. On a Thursday, 3 hours after midnight, Columbus called a Spanish nobleman named Escobedo, and said to him, "I see a fire, and I think we are not far from land," as was then also true. And so the glory remains with Columbus, that he was the first to have found the New Indies. One may well imagine what joy and rejoicing arose among them when they got the longed-for land in sight. Many behaved as if they were out of their senses, for sheer joy, nor could they take their eyes from the sight of the New World. Some fell on Columbus's neck, some kissed his hands with the highest reverence. Even those who had previously insulted him and threatened him most severely begged his forgiveness and asked him to attribute it to their ignorance. Finally, they all offered him their faithful service, and said they wished to be his obedient and devoted servants in praise of his virtue and manhood. Meanwhile, Columbus had a small boat drawn forward, in which he, along with several of his companions, went to land, and landed on the island of Guanahani, where he fell on his knees, raised his hands toward heaven, wept for joy, and spoke such a prayer to God. Lord God, eternal and almighty, thou hast through thy holy word created heaven, earth, and the sea. Thy name be blessed and sanctified. Praised be thy majesty, which has graciously arranged through its poor servant that thy holy name be known and made manifest in this other part of the world. This was a heartfelt act of Columbus, by which he openly confessed that he had not from his own art and wisdom, but through the special grace and gift of God, found the New World for the first time. And as a further sign of his truly Christian and thankful spirit, he had a tree felled and a crucifix fashioned from it, which he had erected on the strand of the sea in the name of Jesus Christ. The right of possession of the New World he exercised in the name of the Catholic kings of Spain. After the course of such things, when Columbus had been some days in India, and deemed it unnecessary, with most of his companions, to remain longer on the small and modest island where they had first landed, he sailed therefore in a small boat back again to the ships that were keeping the high sea, sailed away from there, found many more large and small islands, and having not yet landed in Cumana, named this island Fernandina, in memory and honor of King Ferdinand, who had given him advancement for this voyage. From there, Columbus sailed on account of the rising storm at sea, through which the ships could have been driven against the cliffs and broken, happily and with good wind, and came to the island they called Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. But when he had cast anchor in the royal harbor, the royal ship in which Columbus sat was driven against a cliff, ran aground and was smashed. But the people aboard, as many as were in it, together with a great part of the provisions and goods, were rescued through the help and assistance of the other two ships. It was moreover firmly held that this happened deliberately, that the main ship was intentionally lost, so that he might leave a portion of his people in this province behind. On the north side of the coast stood many Indians who viewed the ships with great wonder and astonishment. But after they saw that the Christians were coming from the ship to land, they did not want to wait, but ran away from them in quick haste, out of fear and terror. The nimble Spaniards pursued them quickly, seized an Indian woman, and brought her to Columbus. Columbus had her given the best Spanish wine and other fine things, and had a clean fair shirt put on her, and gave her to understand through signs and gestures that she should urge her people to come to the ship without fear and alarm, and then let her go again. The other Indians marveled greatly at what had been done with the woman, and when they heard from the woman's report of the Spaniards' friendliness, they came in droves, in their small hollowed-out little boats, to Columbus's ship, to see these strange peoples and clothing. The Spaniards were not a little pleased at this friendly and benign disposition of the Indians, particularly since there was not one Indian in so great a number who did not wear gold, silver, and precious stones as riches at his arms, neck, and ears, which, as they showed it without hesitation, was given by them gladly and abundantly, since they valued gold and silver at nothing. Columbus, when he saw the great troop and number of Indians who had come from all places in small boats, stepped with many Spaniards onto the land, to observe what the Indians would further undertake. There he was received quite heartily and richly by the cacique, for so they call their princes in their language, whose name was Guacanarillo. Columbus honored the royal cacique with fine shirts, handsome knives, mirrors, bells, together with other trifles. In return, the cacique gave Columbus a great and heavy nugget of gold, many precious stones, and other fine things, and sent several of his people in their small boats, canoes or wickerwork boats, to the wrecked ship, to help the Spaniards to bring to land the provisions and goods that were in the ship, which they did so diligently and obediently, as if it had been their own property and goods. Daily there streamed in an uncountable number of people in droves from all parts of these boundaries to see this new and strange folk, and they wondered particularly at the beards of the arrivals, which seemed strange to them. And they brought and shared with the Spaniards all manner of fruits, fish, bread, and other food. When they saw the Christians, they followed their customs and manners like apes. As often as the Christians bowed and inclined, so often did they bend their knees and incline. Likewise, when the Christians raised their eyes devoutly toward heaven, the Indians looked equally toward heaven, because they had heard the Spaniards pray the Ave Maria. They said also when they came in the mornings and evenings, Ave Maria, Ave Maria. Columbus, having noticed the great fruitfulness and richness of the newly found world in gold, precious stones, and other things, and having been informed through winks, pointing, and fingerwork by the inhabitants, was not a little pleased over it. For which reason he was straightway resolved to return to Spain and report to the king the news of the newly found world. Yet beforehand he had with the good friendly will and favor of the cacique built and erected at the same place, from baked stones and other material, a fortress, which was the first house of the Spaniards in India, in which he left 38 Spaniards well provided with armor covering, and weapons, who were to remain in the island until his future arrival, to explore the nature and character of all things. After he had put an order among them and commanded each one how he should conduct himself, with the admonition that they should show themselves wisely, cautiously, and friendly toward the inhabitants in all actions, and do them no harm or shame whatsoever, he took a friendly leave of the cacique and sailed away with his other companions. He took with him 6 Indians along with the gold, silver, precious stones, and jewels that the cacique had given him, also some parrots, together with the uppermost tips of the wonderful Indian maize and other things found in India, and arrived again in Spain with good wind and happy prosperity. Not one of his companions was lost on the voyage, except 2 Indians who died on the high sea, because they could not endure the moisture of the sea and the unhealthy vapor. When Columbus with his ship and companions had landed again in Spain, the king and queen went toward him, received him quite heartily, led him by the hand with royal ceremony into the royal palace, and had him sit down at their side. Everyone at court marveled at the strange creature of the Indians, since they went about so naked and bare. On the contrary, the Indians marveled much more fiercely at the king's and his courtiers' costly clothing and splendid state, and at the previously unseen Christians. The king, when he heard from Columbus the experienced adventures, called him Admiral, at which one may well marvel, and also raised him to high dignities and honors. His brother Bartholomeus he named land governor over the island of Hispaniola. Columbus he named supreme ruler of the sea, and likewise gave him the 10th part of all income from India as his own to keep, from which the sea governors afterwards retained the name Admirandi, or Admiral. Chapter 3. Chapter 2. The Second Voyage of Admiral Christopher Columbus to the New World, in the year of Christ 1493. Since Columbus had now once gained the happy entrance to the islands, and hoped through God's help to discover yet much more and greater regions, he disclosed this his intention to King Ferdinand, who, after he had perceived Columbus's manhood and bold spirit sufficiently from the present discovery, entrusted him with much more, and had 3 large galleons together with 14 caravels, with all equipment and fittings prepared, and ordered into them up to 1,500 armed men, as also a great number of women and young women who had the desire to go there, and had carpenters, stonemasons, cutlers, cobblers, tailors, bakers, and all other craftsmen that would be needed in the newly found island, gathered from all parts of his kingdom and taken along. Above this, Columbus loaded the ships with horses, cattle, swine, goats of both genders, likewise much grain, barley, grapevines, together with all manner of fruits and trees, so that he might settle and fill the new islands. He also brought priests and monks with him, who were to instruct this poor, uninstructed people in the Christian faith. But before they pushed off from land, the Catholic kings of Castile and Portugal had the Pope at Rome, Alexander VI, greeted and requested on this matter, who granted them, and their successors through special power, all the provinces they could find in the Western Indies, and instead of a boundary mark, had a line drawn from one heaven's peak to the other, through the middle circle, to distinguish the places, so that the kings of Castile were to have all regions beyond the line toward the setting sun, the Portuguese, however, everything on this side of the line toward the east. After now everything belonging to the voyage was fully and diligently provided, and sufficiently equipped and readied, the Royal Admiral Columbus sailed on the 2nd of September of the year 1493, again from the harbor of Palos toward the west, toward India, with cheerful spirit and bold heart as before, having with him the 4 Indians whom the king had in the meantime had baptized into the Christian faith. They also took their course somewhat further to the left hand, toward Africa, and as they had sailed some days uncertainly, they saw an island not far from the Canaries, which Columbus named Desiderata, the desired one, because he had a great longing for land, but could sight no land anywhere. As they found in that same region no convenient landing, they steered with great earnestness and zeal straight toward the island of Hispaniola alone. But when Columbus came there, he found not one of the Spaniards he had left behind, still living. At which he immediately sent for the cacique Guacanario, and inquired where his people had gone. He tried to make his meaning understood to Columbus through winks and other signs, that a strange king had come to the island with many people. And when he had seen that these large and strong people had built houses and certain seats, he had grown angry and afraid that they would in time take over the whole island and bring it under their power. He had therefore fallen on them unawares, killed them all, and burned their houses with fire. He claimed he had wanted to faithfully help them in his due obligation, but had been too powerless. He showed a leg wound around with a silk bandage, as if he had been mortally wounded from it. But when Columbus afterwards had the damage inspected, no wound or sign of a wound was found, from which it was easy to conclude that the Spaniards had been killed through the counsel and instigation of Guacanario, and this in the following manner. The Spaniards Columbus had left behind were for the most part sailors, rough, ill-bred, dissolute fellows, who told the inhabitants to hand over gold and silver by force, beat them pitilessly and mercilessly with great clubs and other tools, violated their women, dishonored their daughters, committed all manner of their wills, together with other unseemly vices against them, and whatever they could think of, tormented and afflicted the Indians. At first, and as long as the Spaniards stayed together, the Indians had to put up with their wicked deeds. But where a commander was taken out, the one wanted to be master over the other, for which reason they separated from one another, and roamed and strayed through the island 2 or 3 at a time, and were all killed by the Indians. Most advised Columbus to leave this inflicted insult unavenged. But since the Indians' strength and power was still unknown to him, he wished to hold back the punishment until a later time, so that perhaps no greater damage and misfortune would result from it. In the meantime they disembarked from the ships and landed happily, whereupon Columbus first placed certain ones there to inhabit this region, which he named to Eternal. Columbus had it named Isabella, in honor of Queen Isabella. Straightway after he sent his brother Bartholomeus to the gold mines of Cibao, which had been considered a reasonably strong fortress, and had the same taken by force, and placed him in it with some Spaniards, leaving him stationed there. For the place was considered strong enough to withstand an assault or attack, should they perhaps band together. The fortress built there received the name St. Thomas. The first to discover the vein found a nugget of gold there, but before the Spaniards arrived, the Indians had valued these veins so little, since they did not consider gold worth digging for unless they found it lying above the ground, that Columbus sailed further on to discover the remaining regions and found the island of Cuba and Jamaica as well. From there he immediately turned back toward the island of Hispaniola and found a quite convenient harbor, which Columbus named St. Nicholas. There they cast anchor and kept the remaining ships, of which they had lost 4, still. These had been violently battered by the storm, and were mostly full of water, with scarcely any rudder, so that they might be repaired again, and the people refreshed. His plan was, once the storm calmed, to attack the Caribs, burn their little boats, and exterminate them all. But since Columbus fell into illness, this his intention did not go forward at that time, so that he had to sail back to the island of Isabella. There he found a truly dismal state of affairs. Many Spaniards had he found dead. Those still remaining did not want to obey Bartholomeus's government. At the same time, the Indians had also become restless, for when they saw that the city of Isabella was beginning to be built, they grew discontented that such neighbors should be endured next to them, from whom they suffered all manner of insult and impropriety as before, the incessant robbery, theft, murder, roaming here and there through the island, for which reason they put themselves on the defensive, and besides invented a wondrous stratagem to destroy and exterminate the Christians. They stopped farming, they neglected the customary sowing, they set the mature fruits on fire, and when they had eaten their maize, they sustained themselves on a kind of food of tree pith they commonly use, and left the place where the Christians lived, hiding themselves in the forests. The Spaniards did not expect such cunning, and thought they had grain enough. But when it ran out, they searched but found nothing, so that the poor Spaniards in the cities of St. Thomas and Isabella had to die of hunger, and finally perished. Added to this lay here and there the corpses of starved Indians, through whose stench the air was poisoned, causing a pestilence in which a great number were executed. The Indian disease and other illnesses also arose from the food they had consumed, which was full of moisture. When Columbus now saw the unrest, he had all the Spaniards who were the instigators and ringleaders of this uprising executed. He tried every means and way to reconcile the Indians and make a pact with them. Out of this severity, the Spaniards conceived an envy and hatred of Columbus, so that many among them wrote false and dishonorable things about him and his brother to the king and queen, and complained about them bitterly. Particularly, a Benedictine monk made himself obnoxious against Columbus, who for that reason excommunicated Columbus, and as often as he happened to deal with a Spaniard in court, he forbade him communion. In return, Columbus muzzled him, and let nothing more from his own provisions be handed to him and his companions. Thereupon Columbus resolved that as soon as he returned to his ships, he would travel back to Spain and bring his false accusers and slanderers to light. In those days such a terrible storm came about that the inhabitants, as they affirmed, had never before heard or seen the like in the island. For first a very loud and violent storm wind arose, with such great power, rushing and cracking as if it would carry away heaven and earth together, and topple everything to the ground. At the same time it began to thunder and lightning dreadfully with crashing and banging, as if heaven were falling down. It lightened so sharply one after another that the sky appeared quite on fire. Shortly after came a thick, terrible darkness, so dark that it could be no darker, and no man could see the other for the darkness, but had to grope and feel like a blind man wherever they wanted to go. Meanwhile, the wind overthrew many great trees with great force, and tore them out of the earth with their roots. Likewise some great cliffs fell with dreadful crashing and cracking, through which many houses and villages were heavily shaken, many thrown to the ground. Some homesteads, together with the people, were carried away and torn apart in the air, so that they fell to the ground. Yet more damage was suffered by those at sea, for though the ships were strong, their masts, though still new, were splintered and blown over by the force of the wind, so that an uncountable number of people drowned, and not more than 3 ships, that stood in a somewhat more sheltered harbor, escaped undamaged. During this terrible storm and dreadful rushing and roaring of the thunder, lightning, hail, and violent wind, there was such an eerie howling that it cannot sufficiently be described. From great fear, the people were so dejected and faint-hearted that they behaved as if they were drunk and senseless. No one could hear his own words, though he shouted ever so loudly. The Indians, who were so terrified and disturbed by this unusual weather and new storm that they could scarcely draw breath, let alone shout or speak, had hidden themselves in the hollows and deep mountains. After the weather abated somewhat, they gathered again from all places, held many and various conversations about it, concluded that it had happened by God's will as an example and punishment, on account of their wicked, sinful, and shameful lives, that heaven had grown angry at them, and wished to fall on them, and chase them out of the land. Some of the Spaniards supposed that such a storm had been stirred up by the accursed devil, who, when he noticed that his idolatry and kingdom would come to an end in the islands where he had dwelt for some hundreds of years and been honored as a god and protector of the land, wished to leave this as a memorial to the Indians who had in part willingly, in part been compelled to, accepted the Christian faith, and had themselves baptized. The small crowd held that such power in driving out evil spirits came from the crucifix, which they saw erected there as a sign of salvation. Others, however, considered the violent weather to have been a foreboding and portent of the future uprising and discord that arose among the Spaniards on account of the Indian robbery and wealth. After this suffered misfortune, Columbus, through the craftsmen he had brought to India, had the battered ships repaired and made ready again, so that he sailed back to Spain, full of grief and concern, with good and fortunate wind. And when he came with good luck and wind to the harbor of Palos, he rode from there on post-horses to the royal court, and reported to the king that he had discovered yet more new regions, and alongside this, how he had proceeded with the disobedient and rebellious Spaniards, according to law and equity. He also excused himself of all the insults and accusations with which he had been falsely charged and burdened against the king. But he needed few words for his defense, for he had brought certain great cakes of pure gold, many precious stones, together with other great wealth, which he faithfully handed over to the king. Thereupon the king, as he had openly perceived and thoroughly experienced Columbus's fidelity and uprightness in many matters, comforted him, bade him be of good cheer, even gave him thanks for his good deed and faithful services, and admonished him besides that in future he should deal somewhat more mildly and graciously with the Spaniards. After this, the king commanded that 12 caravels should be quickly fitted out for Columbus, provided with all necessity, provisions, and war munitions. Thereupon Columbus sent these at once, best equipped and readied, to his brother Bartholomeus in the island of Hispaniola. When they came with fortunate wind there and landed roughly on the island, at the place where Roldan Ximenes was then living, whom Columbus had raised from a lowly family to great honors and appointed as judge, he had meanwhile withdrawn from the governor's lordship in obedience, had enticed many Spaniards to himself, and when he came to these arriving ships and held the riches of this island before the greedy people's eyes, tempted them with begging and pleading to rebellion, and to follow him, with the hope that they would all in short time be made great lords. Through this persuasion, he straightway made them apostate, that they promised without delay that they would all share danger, fortune, and misfortune with him. And they immediately seized the provisions brought along, filled and satisfied themselves with it at all their pleasure, and pulled at once with the whole crowd onto the land, began to rob, steal, plunder, pursued the Indians to the utmost, killed men and women, young and old miserably without distinction, and committed also blood shame and all vices against them, pursuing the poor Indians to the very last, and persecuting them. The third voyage of Lord Christopher Columbus the Admiral to the New World, in the year of Christ 1498, while still during the uprising in the island of Hispaniola, stirred up by Roldan Ximenes, Admiral Christopher Columbus with his remaining armada and ship equipment sailed in the year 1498 out of the port of Sanlúcar, and since he had to fear the French pirates, who already had news of the great riches brought out from India, and were therefore waiting on the Spaniards in service, for better safety he directed his course toward the island of Madeira, one of the 7 Portuguese islands, called Azores by its inhabitants, and came there. From there he had sent 6 caravels well provided with provisions ahead to the island of Hispaniola, and himself sailed with the remaining 3 toward the Cape Verde Islands. And when he directed his course somewhat closer toward the northern line, he fell not only into the calm of the sea, but also into the severe and intense heat, in the month of June, in the middle of summer, into great danger and need. Yet when he finally landed with difficulty in India and sailed into the Bay of Paria, not long after he discovered the island of Cubagua, which he therefore named the Pearl Island. For when the admiral had sailed out past this, and saw by chance some Indians in their small wickerwork boats, he commanded his sailors to sail somewhat closer to them in their boats, and to discover who these people were and what region they inhabited. The sailors followed this diligently, and sailed with their boats under the Indians, at whose arrival the Indians were not at all frightened, since they had never before seen clothed people and such a form, but remained still in their boats, and viewed them with great desire as handsome people diligently. The Spaniards noticed and saw that they had many and large seashells in their boats, and supposed at first that they were accustomed to eating them. But when they opened some, they found them full of pearls, from which they received great joy. When they then came to land and stepped ashore, they saw at Indian women's necks, earlobes, and arms extraordinarily large and fine pearls, which however were so common and cheaply held by them, that even the common people and poorest folk were accustomed to wear them. A Spanish sailor gave an Indian woman nearly a cracked earthen shell, and she gave him in return 4 fine and large strings of pearls. With this gift he sailed with great joy to the admiral, and showed them all his pearls. Thereupon the admiral was beyond measure delighted, sailed around the other ships, and cried with a loud voice to them all, "Rejoice, rejoice, for we have today come into the richest island and region in the world." In these matters they sailed closer to land, and landed at the inlet of the river Cumana. And as the inhabitants there saw the great ships, with their artful sails, weapons, war equipment, guns, anchors, masts, sails, and other instruments, and likewise the unusual shape and form of the bearded people, they were highly amazed, stood in stupefaction, and supposed these were not human, but divine works, and the people not mortal, but immortal gods and children of the sun. And shortly after, by pointing, winking, and other signs through envoys, they let the admiral know that he should come to land, for their king had a great longing and desire to have fellowship and friendship with them. Columbus, though they showed all signs of friendliness, and a benign will toward them, did not readily trust them, and supposed there was deceit behind it, for which reason he did not immediately go to land. When the Indians noticed this, they came voluntarily in their small boats to the admiral's ship, stepped in, willingly subjected themselves to his power, and thus turned aside the formed suspicion with their friendliness and humility. When the admiral perceived their self-sacrificing disposition, he received them quite gently toward them, accepted them with the highest friendliness. And when they wished to go back, he presented them with handsome knives, bells, mirrors, shirts, and other trinkets, and inquired besides from them that near the island of Cubagua the pearls and jewels were to be found, and had some Spaniards step out of the ships and onto the land, whom the king called to his house, and after the custom of the land entertained with their wine and food, after his best ability, which agreed well with the exhausted and hungry ones, and was a good refreshment for them. When the royal envoy noticed that they had great desire for pearls, he gave them an incredible quantity of the same. He had very many, and they were held in lower regard than with us glass buttons. When the Spaniards thus filled with so great wealth returned to the ships, the admiral was highly amazed, let himself be content for the time being with the Indians' friendliness, and immediately sent a nobleman named Arohal to the Catholic kings to announce this good news to them, and at the same time sent them also a sample of the finest pearls he had received, and sailed thereafter from there around the point of Veli Capper, and came in due course to the island of Hispaniola, where he found yet great unrest, uprising, and discord. The admiral immediately and without delay undertook with the greatest diligence to still such uprising and discord, wrote to the instigator of this uprising, Roldan Ximenez, and urged him that he should willingly submit to the governor's obedience, and not thus proceed in his villainous and mutinous spirit, and thereby also stop being an obstacle to the Indians' improvement. For it was in no way to be hoped that through such actions and such outrages they could be brought to the Christian faith. And the heartfelt and golden bull of Pope Alexander VI, given to the Catholic king for use of this new region, said that one should not deal with the newly found peoples and heathens in improper ways, but much more attract them with friendliness, mildness, and good examples, so that they might receive a disposition for the wholesome word of God and the holy faith of Christ our Redeemer and Savior. The admiral's faithful warning, begging, and pleading, Roldan spurned entirely and disregarded, proceeded straight on in his evil intention, and publicly showed himself as a ringleader and rebel. And besides, he did not shrink from writing honor-wounding letters to the king, in which he reviled the admiral's brother, the governor Bartholomeus, and complained highly about his ferocity and tyrannical government, saying he had hanged and miserably killed for small and petty reasons the wretched Spaniards as well as the Indians. Columbus defended himself with good grounds and substance against this, and laid the cause of all mischief on his accusers. When this accusation by both parties was sent to Spain, the admiral's brother meanwhile sent against the fallen rebels 80 Spaniards, among whom some were mounted, and though the royalists had more than 6,000 armed men with them, at the encounter they were so frightened by the cavalry's force and fierceness that they retreated to the thick forests and hid themselves, as also 5 other bands with their people did afterward, with whom the Spaniards had several engagements, but always prevailed. All were taken prisoner, and brought back under the admiral's power and government. And when they swore and promised again afresh to stir up no further rebellion against the king in Spain or his governors, the admiral spoke to them in a friendly manner, received them back into his favor, attributed all the bad treatment and injustice they had suffered to the willful and rebellious soldiers, honored them with gifts, and let each one return home in peace to his region. When the admiral and his brother were occupied with these negotiations, the accusations of both sides were delivered at the royal court, from which the king and queen received no small sorrow and worry that matters and conditions in the island of Hispaniola stood so entirely ruined and badly. At the royal court it had become common knowledge among the nobles what great wealth in silver, gold, and precious stones was to be found in these new islands, and each one would gladly have been a governor or official there. But since no one dared openly desire this on account of the great reputation Columbus had with the king and queen, they set up secret court practices as to how they might disgrace the admiral and his brother. The new governor who was sent, a nobleman of the Calatrava order, named Francisco de Bobadilla, abused his office and power, and had these 2 highly deserving men arrested in the harbor immediately after the greeting, put in irons, and so that they might suffer all the greater distress and pain, they were separated from each other, and thus were sent as prisoners under the acts of the proceedings against them in 2 caravels to Spain. When the king was informed that these prominent and well-deserving men were being brought to him in chains, bound at hands and feet in miserable clothing, he was moved to mercy, and without delay sent a swift riding courier with the command that these men be immediately released from prison and fetters, and in costly and splendid clothing, together with a manly escort and guard, be led to him, which then happened. When they came with great pomp and splendid display to the royal court, the king received them with the queen most graciously, and listened to them with the greatest diligence as they stated their innocence, and alongside this revealed their ill-wishers' false slander. The king and queen easily gave credence to this defense, and thus truth held its place. But on the honor slanderers and false accusers, a special punishment and penalty was set and imposed. The 4th voyage of Lord Christopher Columbus the Admiral to the New World, in the year of Christ, 1504, Columbus, after he had remained 3 whole years at the Spanish court after his imprisonment, and had been very agreeable to the king and held in the highest honor by him, longed again to inspect new regions, and obtained from the king by asking and beseeching that he had 4 small ships newly fitted for him and sent to explore other unknown regions. He therefore sailed with his brother from the harbor of Palos on the 9th of May in the year 1504, and came in short time to the island of Hispaniola. When the governor Bobadilla heard of his arrival, he attempted out of his former envy to forbid him that harbor, by which Columbus was strongly moved to anger, and said that the governor was not doing the king a little service in thinking he was pleasing him by locking Columbus out of this harbor and forbidding him landing, who was the very one who had planted these peoples in the island of Hispaniola and made them into inhabitants. Others maintain that the admiral sailed into the harbor by force and was not deterred by Bobadilla's threats. Thereafter he directed his course toward the west and found the island of Guanajam, lying close to the great and wide province called by the inhabitants Higuera, by the Spaniards, however, Capodfontanés. There he was quite royally received, and they brought him in heaps many Indian chickens, bread, and other food, but he detected no indication or sign of gold or jewels, though they later found quite rich veins of gold and silver, which the inhabitants, however, had not regarded. After this, the admiral honored them with small gifts and trinkets, and then turned his voyage eastward and found the region of Veragua. Finally, with his ships, he landed at the islands of Zorab. There it was indicated to him by the inhabitants that the province of Veragua was quite rich. From there he sailed around the coast and came to the Bay of Urubá. There he landed and explored some regions in the North Sea. On this voyage, as Columbus lost 2 ships through storm and shipwreck, and the remaining 2 were also almost drowned, he was forced to turn back. On the return he sailed into the island of Cuba, afterwards Jamaica, and lost many of his people from grief, fatigue, and great toil. The others became for the most part so sick that they could do almost nothing. Over this, Francisco Porcius, a captain over a caravel, together with his brother and a great part of the war people, stirred up a rebellion against Columbus, finally fell away from him, and on small Indian boats fled to the island of Hispaniola. When the Indians now saw the Christians' disunity, and that Porcius had taken the most prominent soldiers away and left the sick with Columbus, they could by no means be moved, neither by begging and pleading, nor by any present and gift, to further share provisions and food with them, but boldly resolved to strike all the Spaniards dead. In this great need, Columbus, without doubt through God's inspiration, devised this way and means. He knew that after a few days a lunar eclipse would occur. He therefore went nearby into a small hut in which some Indians had assembled, called them out, warned them that if they did not share food and sustenance with him and his war people, they would all perish through a pestilence that God would send from heaven, and they should have a true sign. Within 2 days the moon would be entirely extinguished. When this then happened on the day and hour as Columbus had told them, and the Indians saw the moon blood red, they were greatly terrified, and from that same moment brought all food and sustenance from house and home, and whatever they had in hidden places voluntarily, and begged Columbus besides that he would not punish them seriously for this their disobedience. With this rough food, the admiral refreshed and somewhat revived his weak and sick servants. During these things, the rebel Porcius could not get forward with his people in the small Indian boats over the great rough sea waves, and was again forced to give up his intention, of sneaking one of the admiral's caravels so that he could sail to the island of Hispaniola. But his plan and scheme failed, for when he landed again there, both ships had already been drowned. As soon as the admiral heard of Poresius's arrival, he put himself with his sick people and his brother in battle order. When the matter came to open battle, many on both sides were killed and wounded, and Francisco Poresius was taken prisoner. And this is the first battle between Spaniards that happened in the New World. After this victory, the admiral came off somewhat better and was somewhat strengthened, since he had no more ships to sail away from there, and had waited in vain for approaching assistance. He finally had Diego Mendez, his steward, sit in a small Indian boat with some others, and sent him through some Indian fishermen to Hispaniola to get a ship from the governor. He promised the Indians great gifts if they brought Diego and the other Spaniards there unharmed. The Indians, mindful of this, since they could not easily sail with the small boat without great danger on the open sea, sailed for better safety along the shore and through unknown fords that they knew well, and brought them safely there, and then turned back again and reported to the admiral that Diego had now pulled toward Hispaniola from there. When Diego Mendez came to the island of Hispaniola, he handed the governor the admiral's letters. The governor, without delay, once he had read the admiral's need, commanded that a caravel should be fitted and sent to him. Columbus also had one fitted at his own cost, and in short time, with both well provided with provisions and food, sailed to the island of Jamaica to the admiral. Some days later, the admiral got in and sailed to Hispaniola to the governor, refreshed himself there some days, and then broke up from there and sailed with his brother towards Spain, and came there with fortunate wind. There he reported to the king at length all his actions and the story of his voyage, and showed what new islands he had further found, which then brought a special joy to the king and the whole court attendants, who were highly amazed at it, and everyone afterwards praised and held him in honor for his bold and manly spirit. Not long after, he fell into a serious illness from the many voyages, toil, work, and hardship he had endured in his journey, and as it increased from day to day and no medicine would help any more, he finally departed in death and passed away. He was a man of proper and fine stature, strong in body, resourceful and highly intelligent, and lovely and cheerful to look at in face, had clear and healthy eyes, a yellow close-cut hair, a fairly wide open mouth. Above all things, he loved justice, yet alongside he was irascible when he was insulted. The voyage of Amerigo Vespucci to Paria, now called America after his name, in the year of Christ 1497. In the year of Christ 1497, King Ferdinand of Castile had 4 large cargo ships fitted out in Cadiz, provided with people, provisions, artillery, and all necessities, and sent the noble and highly renowned Florentine Amerigo Vespucci on them to discover new lands and drive trade. He sailed with his people on the 20th of May from the seaport of Palos, and came in a few days to the Fortunate or Canary Islands, lying some 280 leagues from Lisbon. When they had provided themselves there with wood, water, and other necessities, they sailed after 8 days, with prayer to God's name and a good south wind from there, and on the 27th day came to a firm mainland about 1,000 leagues from there, lying at 16 degrees of northern height of the northern line, and anchored about 1½ leagues off. Here, when they landed, they saw a great number of people walking about by the sea's shore, and were highly delighted. They were all naked, and it appeared as if they were greatly frightened, since they had never before seen clothed people in such a form. But as soon as these wild people caught sight of them, they fled to a mountain, from which they could be moved neither by winking nor by other friendly signs and gestures to come down and await the address. But since meanwhile night fell, and the ships had no secure landing, they set out the following day to seek a convenient harbor where the ships might be better secured, and sailed the next day from there along the land, where they continually saw people, until on the 4th day they found a good harbor, and landed about half a league off. There they found a great number of people, who desired to speak with the Spaniards. But when the Spaniards went ashore in good order, 40 strong, the wild people began to act shy, and wanted to have absolutely no friendship or fellowship with them, and could be brought to address on no conditions, until they finally enticed a few with great difficulty, presented them with mirrors, bells, coral, and other minor children's toys, reconciled them, and brought them to friendliness. Meanwhile night came on, and they returned to the ships again. But in the morning early, an uncountable number of men and women came, who also brought their children along, of whom many, as the Spaniards approached the land, leapt into the sea, swam toward them the distance of a gunshot to meet them, and received them in a friendly manner. They also walked so confidently and safely among the Spaniards, as if they had long been among them, and were well accustomed, from which they were notably pleased. On the appearance and customs of this people, both man and woman, is quite naked, of middling stature and well proportioned, red-colored, with hair like lions, have no hair on the whole body except on the head, which is blackish and long, particularly on the women. Also on the eyebrows they have none, since they consider that beastly. In build they are in particular fashion, for they have faces like the Tartars. In walking, running, and swimming, both man and woman are very quick, so that a woman can without difficulty run and swim 10 leagues at a stretch, and regards nothing lightly, if she meets the Christians. Their weapons are bows and arrows, and since they have no iron, they make the tips from wild animals and fishes' teeth, which they know how to sharpen very artfully. They use javelins and sharpened clubs. They are very accurate in shooting, in some places also so skilled that they can well hit everything they wish. They customarily wage incessant war against other nations, and show the enemies no mercy when they catch prisoners, holding them back for great torture and slaughter. The women follow them 20 or 30 leagues in war, not to fight themselves, but to carry their necessities, which one of them can carry on her back, more than a strong man can lift from the ground. They have no superiors or captains among them, but each one is lord for himself, without order. They do not wage war to extend their lordship, or from evil cause, but solely from an equally inborn, deep-rooted envy, to avenge the death of their friends and forebears who were killed by the enemies. This people lives in its freedom, and is not subject to anyone, yet they start their wars and prepare themselves for them when their enemies have captured one of their number, or killed him. Then the nearest and eldest friend calls out in the streets and villages, urges everyone with great shouting to go with him to war and avenge this death, who are then moved by compassion and stirred up, straightway prepare for battle, and march against their enemies. They have neither law nor justice, also punish no evildoers, and parents do not honor and discipline children. Slow in speech, but very secretive and sly, they speak seldom, keep their thoughts in the mouth, which they form between their teeth and lips. On 105 leagues, they have another language. In eating, they are quite barbaric, keeping no fixed time, but day and night when each one feels hunger and desire. They sit on the ground. If they want to eat, they have neither tablecloth nor other equipment. They carry their food in wicker bags that they make themselves, and in gourd shells. They sleep in cotton nets in the air, which Vespucci did after them, and found it quite agreeable. In the body they are very clean, since they bathe themselves often. Their necessities they attend to quite privately, but let their water go openly before everyone, both man and woman. In the married state they have neither law nor order. They take as many wives as it pleases them, and let them go again when they wish, holding the women for no dishonor. And in this both men and women are even, and not jealous, but very unchaste, though the women more than the men. They are fruitful and do not shrink from work, even when pregnant, and give birth easily with little pain, so that on the following day they are again fresh and healthy, roaming about. And they go to a river after giving birth to wash themselves, and come back, as fresh and good as before. But they are so given over to cruelty and fierce envy, when someone angers them, that they immediately through sorcerous medicine, out of great anger, kill and abort their own children. And it is highly to be marveled at, that after the birth they appear, as if they had never been pregnant, and the women are indistinguishable from the virgins. They are also not a little lustful toward the Spaniards. For the rest they live quite epicurically without religion. Their dwellings they have in common, and are built in trees, and covered with palm branches, against wind and storm. In some places they are so large that in a single one 600 people can be found. Indeed, Vespucci has found dwellings where 10,000 people live together. They customarily change their dwellings for the preservation of their health and to breathe fresh air, and move to other places, believing that through long habitation the air grows harmful to men and causes many illnesses, which is indeed not to be held unreasonable. Their wealth consists in various colored feathers, small stones, coral, and strings of fishbone, and fine green and glistening stones, which they know how to form and wear for decoration at ears, arms, and legs. They otherwise trade in nothing except what the land brings them, and they value gold, pearls, and such things, which we in Europe hold in high esteem, at nothing. They are quite generous and deny no one anything, but on the other hand they are eager and keen to ask and receive when one deals with them in friendship. The highest friendship, however, they show in this, that they offer their wives and daughters to their guests, and the father considers it a great honor when someone desires his daughter while she is still a virgin and takes her away, and by this friendship is made and maintained. Their dead they bury with water, believing that after death they also eat and receive sustenance. The Christians hold no other mourning or ceremonies over the dead. In other places, however, they have a more human way of burying. For when someone is about to die, his friends carry him into a great forest, lay him in a cotton net tied to 2 trees, dance around him the whole day. When evening comes, however, they set food and drink at his head for 4 days, leave him there alone, and return home. If it now happens that he afterwards eats, drinks, gets well, and comes back to his dwelling, his friends and relatives receive him with manifold ceremonies. But very few of them manage this, for they are visited by no one further. But if they die under the net, they have no other burial to expect. They use many and various medicines, which cannot at all be compared with ours, and it is highly to be marveled at how anyone can be helped by them. And to give only 1 or 2 examples, when someone gets a fever and it plagues him most severely, they dip him into the coldest water and bathe him in it. Then they force him to run back and forth by a strong fire for 2 hours, make him sweat and sleep, and through this many of them recover again. Some among them also use for these and other illnesses a 3 or 4 day fast, and come right again. They also let blood, but not at the arms, but at the loins and calves. They also use certain medicines for vomiting, and many other things, too lengthy to recount here. In their nourishment they are of much blood and phlegmatic moisture, for they sustain themselves with roots, fruits, herbs, and all manner of fish, and have no grain or wheat bread. Their common food or bread is a root from a tree, from which they make flour, which they call juca, others chambi, others big name. They rarely eat other meat than human flesh, after which they are beyond measure greedy and surpass the irrational animals in savagery. For they swallow all their enemies, be they man or woman, whom they have killed in war or held captive for some time for fattening purposes, and that with such ferocity that nothing more terrible is to be seen. Indeed, they even wonder that the Christians treat their enemies more leniently and do not eat them. Similar abominable customs and practices are there more, of which there will follow at another place at greater length. And to return again to the Spaniards and Vespucci's voyage, from which we have diverged, after they had explored this land a little, and found it beyond measure good, and obtained some gold, they agreed to sail further from there, and sailed always along the land, kept their trade with the inhabitants, without landing to do it. After some days they came to a harbor, where they were saved from danger by God. For after they had landed and gone ashore, they found a town that, like Venice upon the water, was built on wooden stakes driven into the sea, with some 20 dwellings shaped like bells. From these men were going back and forth in little boats to visit one another. As soon as these wild people saw the Spaniards, they were greatly frightened, and began lifting their bridges, at which the Spaniards were not a little astonished. Meanwhile they also noticed that 12 canoes, made from a single trunk, were coming across the sea toward them, to look at them. When they tried to entice them closer with all manner of signs, and went toward them themselves, these turned away, and would not come to them, but immediately went ashore on a mountain, and beckoned for them to come, which they also did, bringing 16 young women with them. They placed 4 of them in the Spaniards' boats, at which the Spaniards, not without reason, were astonished at what this could mean. Meanwhile, they mingled among the Spanish boats, and among them, as if they were their best friends, a great multitude of people also swam out from their houses. At this, they could draw no evil suspicion. On top of this, some old women ran from under their doors and began a loud wailing, and as a sign of great anguish and need, tore their own hair out, which caused a suspicion of great misfortune among the Spaniards. Whereupon the young women leaped from the boats into the sea, and the others too rowed further from the ships, and began shooting powerfully at the Spaniards with their bows. They also noticed that others who had swum out from their houses to the ships were carrying their weapons under water, from which their treachery was sufficiently evident. Thereupon the Spaniards put themselves on the defensive, shot many of their boats to the bottom, killed around 20 of them. The rest leaped into the sea and swam thus with loss to the shore. 5 Spaniards were wounded, but all recovered again. They captured 2 of the aforesaid young women and 3 men, visited thereafter their houses, in which they found no one but 2 old women and 1 sick man, for which reason they did not destroy the town, though they had resolved to set it on fire. They thus returned to the ships with the 5 prisoners. The 2 young women and 1 man, however, escaped during the night through the negligence of the watch. After this they resolved to sail away from there again, left the harbor, and sailed along the mountains some 80 leagues to another people whose language was very different from the other. And when they had landed, they found some 4,000 people together, who did not want to wait for the Spaniards at all, but left everything behind and fled into the thick forests. But as the Spaniards followed them, they found a gunshot away from there many huts that the people had built for their fishing, and various animals and fish being cooked and roasted. Among other things, a winged snake was being roasted, at which they marveled greatly. When they came a little further, they found in other huts many live snakes of the aforesaid kind, which were fastened at the feet with fetters, and had their mouths bound with ropes, so that they could not harm people, as one is accustomed to put a muzzle on bears, dogs, horses, and other wild animals. They looked so dreadful that the Spaniards did not want to touch them. Their bread they make from fish, which they first boil, then pound, and dry again over the coals, and this is good to eat and well flavored. Otherwise they have more food from fruits and roots, which would be too long to list here. When no one came from this people that day, and they could discover nothing further, they left in their huts, for better trust, something of their goods, and betook themselves by night back to the ships. But in the morning, as soon as day broke, they heard an uncountable number of people on the shore. The Spaniards went ashore there. The wild people at first acted shy, but then mixed among the Spaniards, and began to walk freely and securely among them, as if they had long been acquainted and accustomed with them, from which they were notably pleased. The Spaniards indicated to them that they did not have their dwelling here, but had only come for the sake of fresh water. They were therefore invited to go with them to their dwellings, which they promised to do. And they received them the 3rd day in a village of some 40 houses, and were received with strange ceremonies, jumping, half-laughing, and weeping, and all manner of dishes of all kinds of food. When they stayed there that night, they offered them their wives freely, and with such urgency and lack of restraint that they could scarcely resist them. The following morning yet another uncountable number of people came there to see them. The elders begged them most earnestly to go further into the land with them and see their dwellings, which they promised to do. And it is almost beyond expression in what great joy they were. When they had spent almost 9 days with them, and could well imagine that those on the ships would be greatly worried and troubled about them, they returned on the 18th day, but were accompanied and served by an uncountable number of people, both men and women, down to the sea. For when anyone grew tired, they carried him in their nets most diligently and with special care. Indeed, some counted themselves fortunate if they could carry a Spaniard across the streams, of which there are many there, on their back. They also gave them their provisions and gifts which they had presented them with, fruits, bows, arrows, parrots of various colors, and other things. Some took their children and livestock along with them. When they thus all came together to the sea, they did not want to leave the Spaniards, but climbed so abundantly into the small boats that they almost sank. Others swam to the large ships, so that 1,000 of them, more or less, came aboard and viewed with the greatest wonder the ship equipment, artillery, anchors, masts, sails, and other things. To get rid of them again, the Spaniards let several large guns go off. When the Indians heard this dreadful roaring and thundering, most of them leaped into the sea, dived under like frogs when they hear a noise, and swam away, which was entertaining and laughable to see. But they pacified the frightened Indians again, and gave them to understand that they used such weapons to kill their enemies, and kept them the day in the ship, but let them go the following morning, after they had been well fed and entertained most graciously. Their customs and practices are almost the same as the others, which it would be needless to describe. This land is very populous, has many and various animals unlike ours, except that lions, bears, deer, swine, and roe deer resemble ours. But they have no donkeys, dogs, cattle, or sheep, but instead many other unknown wild animals that they cannot otherwise use. Otherwise the region is beyond measure pleasant, fruitful, always with green forests whose leaves never fall from the trees. It lies in the zona torrida, the burning region, and Cancer Circle, at 23 degrees of height. The wild people marveled greatly at the Spaniards' appearance, particularly that they were white of body, and asked from whence they had come, to which they answered, From heaven, come down, which they not only believed, but in great numbers had themselves baptized. The Spaniards called them in their language Cherai, that is, wise and high people, and their land is called Paria. From here they left this harbor and sailed further, some 1,360 leagues from there, always keeping the land in sight, and often going right round the area. Meanwhile they traded with the wild people and obtained gold at most places, though not much. After they had now spent some 13 months on this voyage, become weary of trade, their provisions almost consumed, and been exhausted by great toil, they resolved to improve their ships again, and to sail home to Spain. In the best harbor in the whole world, where they were received in a friendly manner by an uncountable number of people, they repaired their ships there, built new boats, and also put their artillery right again, which had been badly damaged by the water, at which the wild people willingly helped them, and shared their food with them, which agreed very well with the Spaniards, for they would otherwise not have been able to reach Spain again. They stayed there 42 days, and the inhabitants showed them all possible service, love, and friendship. And the Spaniards, having now become accustomed to them, began to confide to them with earnestness and great emotion their distress and need with lamentation. They confided how secretly every year a wild people from 100 leagues away was accustomed to come, through treachery or force, and to capture and kill many of them, and they begged them to deliver them from this great tyranny. Although the Spaniards had now proposed to sail home, they were moved by compassion to help them, and take revenge on their enemies. They promised it, at which they were highly delighted, and desired to go with them themselves. But this was refused them for certain reasons. The Spaniards took only 7 of them along, to look on this revenge and tell the others of it, which they accepted with quite grateful hearts. After they had repaired and equipped their ships again, they sailed away from there and came to many islands, some inhabited and some uninhabited. When they landed at the island of Tage and went ashore in the boats, there were 400 people on the shore, well-equipped men and women, who began to resist their landing with all force. They were naked but strong of body, armed with bows, arrows, spears, and square shields, and shot and pressed powerfully on the Spaniards when they were still a gunshot from land. On their bodies they were painted in various colors, and adorned with all manner of feathers, which according to the wild people's indication, signified that they were about to go out to war. Since they would not let the Spaniards land, they let the large guns go off among them with stones, so that many of them fell to the ground. And as they were greatly frightened at this terrible report, and saw that many of them lay dead, they turned and fled. Thereupon 42 well-equipped Spaniards came ashore, and met a great multitude of such wild people, who put themselves bravely on the defensive, and skirmished bravely for about 2 hours. When they saw that so many of them had been shot and stabbed, and the Spaniards chased them incessantly, they finally took to flight, and hid themselves in the thick forests. Since the Spaniards were also badly wounded, they returned with the 7 Indians they had brought along, with exceedingly great joy, to the ships. But the following day, the remaining people came marching in order with horns, intending to take revenge on the Spaniards for their loss. Thereupon, it was straightway deliberated that if they could be brought to goodness and friendship, one should put oneself on the defensive, receive them as enemies, and as many as one could get should be sold. So 77 well-equipped Spaniards went ashore, whom the wild people, doubtless fearing the great guns, did not hinder in any way. And the battle began again most fiercely on both sides, lasted a good while, yet the Spaniards finally kept the field, after they had killed many of the enemy and captured 25 prisoners. On the Spaniards' side only 1 remained. Several were wounded, but all recovered and came to rights again. After this, they resolved to take their voyage back to their homeland, dismissed the aforesaid 7 Indians, of whom 5 had been captured in the war, together with 5 of the captured enemies, namely 3 men and 4 women, and sailed further until they finally arrived on the 15th of October in the year 1498 at the port of Palos, with 222 captives, welcomed cordially by everyone, and sold their captives there. And this is thus the most memorable thing that happened on this first voyage. Amerigo Vespucci's second voyage to America, in the year of Christ, 1499. Since the first voyage had gone reasonably well, King Ferdinand in Castile had yet more ships equipped, intending through Don Amerigo Vespucci to discover other regions. He sailed with his subordinate people in the year 1499 from Castile and held the previous course from the Green Islands toward the burning region near Tierra del Fuego. When they had provided themselves with wood and water there, they took their course southward until on the 19th day they sighted firm mainland, the land lying across from the other, of which mention was made at the beginning of the previous voyage. On the eastern side, outside the northern line, 2 degrees south of the southern line, 200 leagues from the Canary Islands. But when they found this land everywhere inundated with great water, and had sailed around for a long time, they could find no harbor anywhere, nor catch sight of any human being, though they could tell from the land that it was inhabited, since it was everywhere built up, always green, and covered with great and tall trees. They then sailed further from there, and after much going here and there came finally to a very pleasant harbor. And when they had landed there, they found some 4 leagues from there on land a great city, at which they were not a little delighted. Meanwhile, they also saw from the ships 12 canoes with many Indians coming from the high sea toward them, to whom they sent some boats that surrounded them from a distance. But when they began to approach the Indians more closely, the Indians raised their oars and kept still, wanting thus to put themselves on the defensive. Thereupon yet another small ship was dispatched, which cut the wind from them, and they worked all day long, but could get only 2 of them, as the others leaped into the sea and swam to land, though they were 2 leagues away from it. In their abandoned boats they found 4 young fellows who were not of their people, but had been captured elsewhere, whose male member had just been cut off, at which the Spaniards marveled. When these were taken into the Spaniards' ships, they gave to understand by signs and gestures that this was the terrible, inhuman people of the cannibals, human eaters, by whom they had been captured and were to be taken home for fattening and then consumed. When they turned back to within half a league from land, and heard many people on the shore who all straightway hid in the thick forests upon the Spaniards' arrival, and they wanted to wait for some of them, they adorned the one captured man with bells, looking-glasses, and other trinkets, and sent him to his people, to show the fugitives how the Spaniards were not their enemies but friends. He accomplished this so diligently that he brought back some 400 men and women with him. And since they were naked and unadorned, the Spaniards made friendship with them, and set before them for the confirmation another captured man in his canoe, which was made from a whole tree, 26 ells long and 1½ ells wide. They all ran away together quickly, and wanted to have no further fellowship with the Spaniards, from which they could see the barbaric customs and wildness of this people. There was little gold among them, for they had only a little at their ears. When there was now nothing more to be obtained here, they sailed away and came from the east into a safe good harbor, landed there, and were received in a friendly manner by the same people there, were honorably and well treated. They received there for a single bell 500 pearls, and were given a little gold. In this land they make their drink from fruits and roots. The best is from myrtle apples, quite healthy and wholesome. This land is in other things very fruitful, and the people quite courteous and of good conversation, the like of which is not to be found anywhere in America. They stayed in this harbor and land some days with particular pleasure, and were visited daily by the inhabitants, who greatly marveled at the Spaniards' appearance, white color, clothing, armor, and ship size. They also indicated how they had enemies toward the east, among whom grew and were to be found many pearls, and how they had been divided among them, that they had done battle against the same people, and informed the Spaniards how the pearls grew and were to be fished, which they also found to be so afterward. After this they sailed from there and came to another harbor, sent a boat there, encountered indeed a great number of people, but could not bring them to their friendship either by force or by other means. They wanted to go ashore in the boats and step off, but the people resisted them with all force and would not let them land. Even if they came to shore, these people did not want to deal with them in any way and fled into the wild forests. The Spaniards left on account of the wildness of this people, and sailed 15 leagues further to another island, where they found the calmest, simplest, and also most harmless people, the like of which they had never seen, of such shape and customs as we want to describe briefly. They are completely ugly both in face and body, have their cheeks always full of green herbs, which they constantly chew like livestock, and can say little for it. At their necks they carried in 2 short hollowed gourds an herb and flour, which they chewed together and discharged again. They did this often, which the Spaniards observed with great wonder, and afterwards learned the reason for. This people is so courteous that they mixed quite freely among the Spaniards, and walked with them as if they had long been friends and acquaintances. The Spaniards strolled and walked with them into the land, and desired to go with them to the fresh water. Only when they found it did they discover what the people had been chewing, for they gave to understand by pointing that there was absolutely no water to be found among them. They therefore chewed the aforesaid herb against thirst, which they also offered to the Spaniards. They also explained that they sometimes quench thirst with dew, which falls on certain leaves resembling hare's ears. Otherwise they have no fruits. Those in a firm land have them, and must make do with fish. They have no houses or huts at all, but use only wide leaves with which they cover themselves against the sun's heat, but not against rain, though it is probable that it rains little there. When they go out fishing, each one carries such a large leaf and sets it up at the shore, so that when the greatest heat comes he can hide under it. There are various animals there, which must all drink rainwater from puddles. They sailed away, and came to another island. Since at first they heard no people, they supposed it must be entirely uninhabited. But when they went ashore, they noticed in the sand certain large footprints, from which they could infer that in this island large people and giants must dwell, which afterwards proved itself. For when 9 of them followed a path with the intention of finding fresh water, they came a mile away to 5 houses, in which they found 2 large women, whom they met, at which they were greatly astonished. As soon as these same giants also caught sight of the Spaniards, they were so frightened that they stood rooted to the spot, and every ability left them. Finally, however, the old women began to speak with the Spaniards in their language, led them into a hut alone, and shared with them what they had of food. Thereupon, the Spaniards resolved to take these young daughters by force, and bring them to Spain as a wonder. While they were still deliberating about it, look, some 36 naked men came, who were a good deal larger than the women, and so well formed of body that it was well worth seeing. At their arrival the Spaniards were frightened, and wished they had stayed on their ships, for they had large clubs and maces, and were brave and bold-looking people. When these giants had come into the hut, they began to talk with each other, perhaps wanting to harm the Spaniards. When the Spaniards now noticed their danger, various plans were discussed among them. Some wanted to attack them in the hut, others were completely against it, and wanted it to happen outside in front of the hut, and at a suitable distance. The third group thought one should not attack them at all, but wait and see what they undertook. In these deliberations, they went out of the hut, and took their way toward the ships. The giants followed them slowly, a stone's throw behind, and were just as timid as the Spaniards. For when the Spaniards stood still, the giants stood still too. But when the Spaniards moved forward, the giants also followed after. When they had reached the boats and got in, the wild people all leaped into the sea and began shooting powerfully at the ships with bows, without however doing any damage. And they were so startled by the great guns that they immediately took flight to the nearest mountain. This island the Spaniards afterwards named the Giants or the Colossians Island, because they had found such people there. And they had many a skirmish with them wherever they sailed, and wanted to take something, since they absolutely would not permit anything to be fetched from their land. Now, when Vespucci and the Spaniards had been almost a year on the sea, their provisions had run out, and they had been exhausted by the severe heat, since they were almost always in the burning region, and had twice crossed the northern line. They resolved to sail into a good harbor somewhere, to repair their ships and get themselves home again. So from the Giants' Island they came to another people, by whom they were quite courteously received and treated. They obtained there more than 119 marks worth of pearls, at bells, mirrors, and other small trinkets, and sometimes a whole pound for a single bell. They are fished there in the shells, and sometimes 100 or more are found between the flesh. When they are ripe, they fall out, and if they are unripe, they are good for nothing, and wither and come to nothing. When they had waited here, they sailed from there to the island of Antigua, which had been discovered a few years earlier by Christopher Columbus, stayed there 2 months and 2 days, repaired their ships, and equipped themselves again for the homeward voyage. Finally, they departed from there on the 22nd of July, and after 1.5 months, on the 8th of September, came to the port of Palos, where they were received with great honor and most heartily by everyone. Now we want to turn to King Ferdinand in Spain and the events in the island of Hispaniola. King Ferdinand had heard of the manifold unrest and uprising in the island Hispaniola with much displeasure, deliberated in many ways how to bring these disturbed matters to peace, and govern the island with use and peace and justice. After long and manifold deliberation, he thought it good to remove the old governor Bobadilla, and send a new one in his place. He therefore chose Nicolas de Ovando, supreme master of the Knights of Lazarus, for this purpose, and sent him there under the title and designation of royal governor. He sailed with 30 ships from the seaport of Sanlúcar, and arrived on the 40th day at the island of Hispaniola. When Bobadilla saw that a much stronger and more powerful man, one with greater power and authority than himself, had come there, he voluntarily withdrew from his governorship, and resolved to sail with the Spanish Armada, in which the royal governor had arrived, to Spain. He had for this purpose an incredible sum of gold, some 150,000 ducats, not counting many and uncountable pieces of unrefined gold, among which one piece was valued at over 3,000 ducats, which he had intended specially for the queen, loaded onto the ships. Also followed him and sailed along at the same time Roldan Jimenez and many other commanders and captains, together with other 400 persons, all well and heavily laden with gold and precious stones and other great goods. And they sailed away in great joy and luxury, all their hopes set on this wealth. But then, see, over these godless people, who were stained with all shame and vices, and over their vain hope on account of the obtained wealth, there opened the just and true verdict, judgment and revenge of God. For on the sea there arose a great and terrifying storm, and drove the whole armada here and there. 24 ships went to the bottom, with all the people, livestock, and great goods. Particularly, however, Bobadilla and Roldan, together with all the royal income, and the golden platter on which before the soldiers ate a roasted piglet, it was to have been presented to the queen, all went to the bottom. At the same time it had become commonly known throughout the whole kingdom of Spain what great wealth in silver, gold, and precious stones was to be found in the new island of Hispaniola, Cubagua, Cumana, and other places found by the admiral, through which many were moved to sail there at their own cost and wages, to visit these places and obtain such great wealth in gold and precious stones. When the king learned of this, he had a public and strict mandate published, forbidding under pain of death that no ship captain or patron, of whom some were powerful in Spain, should sail and come with ships without his will and permission to the regions discovered by Columbus within 50,000 steps, which is 50 Italian leagues. Whoever sailed over this border should forfeit his life without all grace, but he gave everyone authority and free will to sail to other places and ends not yet discovered. Following this, the outstanding and powerful sea captain Alphonsus Niño fitted out 30 well-armed ships and took to the sea, intending to find and disclose yet more unknown regions and islands. In these were some Spaniards who had previously been on the discovery of the island of Cuba in Columbus's voyage. They sailed straight to India, and when they arrived there, they could not restrain themselves from the desire and greed of wealth, but transgressed the king's command, and immediately landed in the Bay of Paria. From there streaked here and there through many islands and provinces previously discovered by Columbus, searched the whole borders of the islands of Cumana, Amaracapana, and other islands, and conquered gold and goods there. There Alphonsus also stepped onto the land with his companions, was received in a friendly manner by the same people, and after making acquaintance and friendship, exchanged various goods and toys with them for precious stones and pearls, and thus sailed again towards Spain with great wealth and splendor. But when they divided the gold and precious stones on the way, the captain and the war people became discontented with each other, each wanting more than the other. When they were near Spain, and it came into sight, they sailed from the port of Palos and would not land there, so that they would not be caught according to the king's mandate, since they had sailed to the islands and borders discovered by Columbus, and directed their ships toward Galicia. But this did not help them, for as soon as they had landed and stepped ashore, certain of Alphonsus's ship companions who had previously had a quarrel with him went secretly to the governor of that province and indicated that Alphonsus had not only transgressed the royal mandate in that he had been uncovered and sailed to the islands of Columbus, but had also committed an open theft against the royal treasury, since he had taken great wealth of pearls and other fine jewels from the Indians away, and thus openly and knowingly robbed the king's estates. As soon as the governor understood this, he had Alphonsus immediately arrested and thrown in prison. When he had sat in prison a long time and consumed the greater part of the pearls and precious stones, they finally sent him as prisoner to King Ferdinand at the Spanish court. Then some monks went to India to instruct the Indians in the Christian faith. There many Spaniards also came, who began trading with the Indians and began establishing monasteries and churches there. But the Indians, who had long been tired of the Spaniards' fellowship and strict government, fell on the Spaniards early one morning, not only on the common Spaniards, but also on the clergy, and killed and murdered many of them. Yet some escaped that danger and destruction through the help of a small ship that stood by the river of Cumana at the shore, and sailed straight to the island of Dominica, where they reported the Cunanese uprising to the governor Bartholomeus. He quickly gathered 200 well-equipped Spaniards and appointed Didacus Ocampo as captain over them. This captain sailed with his warmen from the harbor of Dominica and arrived in a few days at the island of Cumana. So that he might quickly entice the Indians to him in his ship, he acted as if he knew nothing of the uprising, and used this stratagem. He had all the warmen, except the sailors and ship servants, hide themselves in the lowest part of the ship, under the deck, so that when the Indians saw how few people were in the ship, they would come all the more ready to it, as supposed they came from Spain, and not from the island of Dominica. As soon as the Indians caught sight of the ship, they ran in droves to the shore and asked from where they came. When they received the answer that they were sailing from Castile to trade with them, some Indians were suspicious, but others voluntarily stepped into the ship and brought some precious stones and other wares with them, acting as though they wanted to drive trade with the Christians. And seeing that there were so few in the ship, some came back onto the land and informed the people how few Christians they had found in the ship. Thereupon the royal Indian commander said there should yet many more step into the Spaniards' ship, and indicate to the captain that the royals in this same region had beyond measure many pearls and precious stones to barter for other wares, and that some few Christians might step with them onto the land as well, so that they could thereby put their secret murderous plan into effect the more easily, and bring the Spaniards to the slaughter block. But all this was turned around. The captain, supposing he now had enough prey in the hunting net and needed to wait no longer for an opportunity, immediately gave the hidden warmen a signal from the ambush to attack, who unexpectedly fell on the Indians, some taking prisoner, some killing. Very few leaped in distress into the water and escaped through flight. All those, however, whom the captain held prisoner in his power, he had hanged at the ship's bow, so that he might put all the greater fear into the others, to guard themselves against rebellion and resistance. Through this their stubborn spirit was broken, so that they hid themselves frightened here and there in secret places and caves. After this the captain sailed to the island of Cubagua, and when he came back to Cumana, he raged terribly through his warmen among the Indians, and spared no one, until he had almost exterminated all of them. When those remaining finally obtained peace, though with difficulty, they had to build with their own hands the small fort called Toledo, and from there he sailed to the island of Cubagua and continued the pearl fishing. Meanwhile, 8 Dominican monks arrived and set up 2 small monasteries, one in the island of Cumana, the other in Americapana, and began planting the Christian faith and teaching the children of the royals and most prominent people of the land to read and write. From this then such a friendship, peace and trust arose on both sides that the Spaniards could from now on everywhere safely and undisturbed trade and conduct themselves. When now various things happened in the island of Cumana, Bartholomeus de las Casas, a priest and doctor of Holy Scripture, when he heard of the heartfelt pearl fishing near the island of Cubagua and what great profit it yielded, was moved so that he went in Spain to the royal court, and indicated to the king there was no shame, vice, or sin against God and man that the Spanish warmen had not practiced and committed against the poor inhabitants of the islands of Cumana, through daily insults, the highest force and injustice, urged to uprising. So when they broke the promised faith, not one Spaniard was safe among them in the whole land, but they killed them all without any mercy. To counter this, he requested the king to entrust him with the administration of the government, and promised besides for certain, as soon as he arrived there, he would still all tumult, disorder, and uprising without any bloodshed, and bring the region to quiet and peace. He also wanted to hold the Indians with equitable, moderate, and bearable government in check, so that they would give him great thanks for it. Above all, he promised to improve the royal income, tolls, and rents beyond measure. Against this, Dr. Ludovicus Zapata, and others more who were then set over the affairs of India, resisted most fiercely, held him incapable of these matters and inexperienced in the customs and practices of this region. But it was in vain. He was, despite this, through the special intercession and mediation of the Count of Nassau and other Netherlandish lords at his request, granted, principally because it looked as if he was doing these things out of special zeal for the Christian name. As soon as the government over this region was promised him, he gathered 300 peasants who should attend to the pearl fishing in place of the Indians. And so that they would accept this dangerous voyage more willingly, he begged the king to grant them a coat of arms and a banner with a red cross of the Johanniter order. The king permitted all this, and had some ships prepared, and these plentifully provided with all necessity and provisions. Thereupon this doctor sailed with his armada from Seville, and with good wind arrived in short time in the island of Cumana. And when he encountered Didacus Ocampo, roughly there, he presented him the royal command. Ocampo declared himself obedient to it, on the condition that the supreme admiral would provide and stock him with ships, provisions, and sustenance, and then would set him free, for he had been appointed there to hold the rebels in check until a new governor was sent from the king. When the doctor saw that the king's command had little force with Didacus and was refused by him, he resolved to sail to the island of Dominica, to the admiral, and complain of Didacus's stubborn disobedience. But before he left the island, since he would not let him into the city of Toledo, he quickly built a wooden house at the shore, and placed all his provisions, artillery, and baggage in it, together with the spiritual knights to guard it, until he returned from the island of Dominica to the admiral. Not long after, however, the warmen fell quite out with each other in the division of the loot and the pearls, over which Didacus grew so angry that he ran away with the best of the warmen from there. When the royals in the island of Cumana noticed that now few Christians were left outside those whom the doctor had left in a single house for the meeting, and the others were roaming and raiding through the region, robbing, dishonoring women and young women, and otherwise committing vices and transgressions against them, they stirred up yet another rebellion, and fell early in the morning on the Spaniards wherever they met them in the island of Amaracapana and the surrounding borders of the sea toward the west. They spared neither the clergy either, but killed the monks over the altar and mass, besieged and captured the doctor's house, and brought them miserably to death with their poisoned arrows for the most part. A few of these knights with some monks escaped in a small boat, were rescued from danger and destruction through God's grace, and sailed to the island of Cubagua with great lamentation. They also vented their fury and anger on inanimate things, burned their houses down, tore down the churches and monasteries, smashed the bells, destroyed the images, threw down the crucifix too, and dragged it in the dirt through the streets. Also killed the Spaniards' chickens and dogs, and showed the believing Indians no mercy either, but equally murdered them, and finally trampled and beat the place and ground where they had lived, and ground it into the earth, so that one could see what a terrible and tyrannical people they were. The Indians' tyrannical action also greatly frightened the Spaniards in the island of Cubagua, for if they had ships, they would have practiced equal cruelty against them. For this reason, the governors and treasurers sent a small ship to the supreme admiral in the island of Dominica, and had him told of such terrible uprising that had gone on in the island of Cumana. As soon as the admiral understood this pitiful news, he without delay appointed 500 Spaniards under their commander Jacobo Castiglione to quell the arisen uprising in the island of Cumana. But the doctor, when he had heard of his knight's destruction, immediately went into a preaching monastery out of great distress, and thus gave up and abandoned his undertaking and captainship. Castiglione arrived on the 8th day, after he had sailed out of Hispaniola, with his army in the island of Cumana, fought against the Indians for 40 whole days in succession, lost a great number of them, and though they also manfully defended themselves and killed many of the Spaniards, yet finally by force they were compelled to submit to the commander's obedience, beg for grace and peace. Thereupon Castiglione dealt quite vigorously and energetically with the subjugated Indians, had 70 royals, who were the ringleaders of the rebellion, put in fetters, but sent the common rabble in some ships as prisoners to the island of Hispaniola, where they were sold as bondsmen. After that he built at the mouth of the river of Cumana a fortress, so that ships could anchor there more safely. He also had the destroyed city of Toledo rebuilt, and built in the island of Cumana a small town of 70 houses, named it Coliseum, to which not long after 4 Franciscan monks came from the island of Dominica and built a monastery as a permanent seat there. When they had settled enough in the island of Cumana, the pearl fishing was again taken up and driven. Before we proceed further to describe the remaining history, we want first to indicate for what reason the Middle Indian Indians were captured as bondsmen and brought into the Western Islands. From the moment Admiral Columbus had discovered the Middle Indian India, the Spaniards had been drawn there by the desire for wealth, run from one region into another, robbed, plundered, and stolen, until through the daily overrunning and crowding the Indians had grown entirely rebellious, hateful, and tired of them. And when they could not get rid of them and ceased, but tormented and afflicted the Indians with unbearable means, force, taking away their gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, and such by force, they could and would no longer endure such misery and wretchedness, and unanimously deliberated with each other, to entirely drive all the Spaniards out of their land, and cursed themselves besides that they had not at first resisted the Spaniards, driven them from the land, or killed all of them. The Spaniards, however, both clergy and laity, after they had learned through long daily experience the Indians' customs and way of life, and had often proved that they loved neither friendship nor the Christian faith, and desired to accept it, that they also mocked and despised the gospel, that their stubbornness served only the governors, but not the clergy for use and good. Some Dominican monks went back to the New Spain, came to the royal court, and lodged such complaints about the Indians before King Ferdinand. The Indians were namely given over to idolatry, by nature uncultured people, boy defilers, liars, rough, beastly, senseless, without judgment and understanding, inclined to uprising, untamed, inhuman, and vengeful, smearing their arrows with such poison that when a man is hit by one, he must die with great insanity and pain. They were quite naked and shameless, let no hair or beard grow. When any hair began to grow in their youth, they pulled it out with a little pair of tongs, or other instrument by the roots. They ate human flesh, ate the most disgusting and filthy animals, such as frogs, lice, grasshoppers, earthworms, and such. Their highest pleasure and joy was in eating and drinking, and they held no constancy or fidelity in the married state. All was the same to them. There was no people under the sun that so stubbornly persisted in its customs and practices. They had no compassion or mercy with the sick, even if they were very closely related, even their brothers and sisters. They abandoned them nonetheless, and so that they might be rid of them, they carried the sick, even the half-dead, far away from them into the dark forests and bushes, so that they need not look at them, where they were then either devoured by the wild animals or had to die quite miserably, without a single consolation, like animals. As for their faith, they held no trust or belief anywhere, and even if they swore 1,000 times to some potentate's power and lordship, they held to it not a moment longer than they saw their advantage. Then they fell away without fear and fright, of which His Royal Majesty had already often experienced and seen. And in short, there was no people under the sun worse, more dreadful and terrible than these Indian peoples, and it would therefore be much better and more reasonable if one sold them as bondsmen rather than letting them freely follow their will. When King Ferdinand heard of these people's godless customs and shameful life, he immediately assembled his great council and brought the monks' accusation forward, requesting that they would give their faithful counsel and opinion on what one should do with this rough and wild people. Without any further reflection on what would be useful and good here, or what danger and misfortune might follow from it, they decreed and resolved. It appeared to them, and they held it for good, that the Middle Indian Indians, who could not easily be held in obedience, should be taken away as bondsmen into eternal servitude, on the grounds that they would thereby desist from their coarse error, become Christians, and desire to learn Christian life from the Spaniards. This decree and resolution of the Parliament, the king confirmed with his power and authority, had it sealed with the seal of the realm, and appointed Didacus Niques over the realm and Alphonsus de Hojeda over Cartagena as governors, and charged them to execute this decree in such a manner that before they began to war with these peoples and showed them weapons, they should first arrange to have the holy gospel preached to them, have them seriously admonished to desist from their unclean customs and damnable vices, and to live in a friendly and peaceable manner with Christian and upright men, that they should also hold the Spaniards' fellowship and alliance in high honor and swear to it from the heart. If they accepted these articles in the covenant and kept this mandate diligently, the king in Castile would not only grant and permit them their freedom, but recognize and hold them all in general as his faithful subjects. On the other hand, however, if they refused and showed themselves disobedient, he had commanded them to capture all of them and lead them away into eternal servitude. Likewise, they should also pursue their bodies, wealth, and property with sword, fire, and bloodshed to the last. The aforesaid governors and land rulers sailed in the year 1509 from the seaport of Sanlúcar and came with good fortunate wind to the island of Hispaniola. Whereupon Hojeda on his own cost had 4 powerful ships prepared and settled with 400 experienced warmen, with which he sailed from the harbor of Dominica and in a few days came to New Cartagena. When he landed there with his war people, and had the royal mandate and command publicly read out to the Indians through an interpreter, alongside with friendly words that they should live peacefully and honor the Christians' friendship and alliance, likewise abandon their foul and coarse customs, and accept the Christian faith. If they did this, the king in Castile would deal with them in a friendly manner and hold them as the most beloved and dearest friends. To this proposal the Indians answered with short words and said they had no need of the king of Castile at all. Therefore the Spaniards should straightway turn around and go back from where they had come. Beyond this they should know that they could not and would not tolerate strange peoples who came to them, as long as they were good and devout, but with those who could do nothing else but evil, and were never satisfied with injustice and vices, they wanted to have absolutely no fellowship. When the governor heard this answer from the Indians, he had his whole war force step ashore, and began burning, killing, and destroying at all points in these borders, and spared no one, neither young nor old, neither woman nor man. Every Indian they found had to pay with his neck. Yet though this decree concerned only the Caribs who ate human flesh, the Spaniards applied this edict in all other places without distinction, where even these beastly customs were not prevalent, and had the royal edict publicly read and posted through all provinces and regions, so that no one could claim ignorance or need to excuse himself, that all those who refused to accept the preaching of the gospel should be seized as disobedient and led away and used as bondsmen. The aforesaid governor Hojeda, when he had ranged some 12 leagues through the mainland of New Cartagena, fallen on the people in the land, and severely harassed them, out of the confidence that he would find a great sum of gold there, as certain Indians had indicated to him, brought nothing out of this campaign other than certain harmful and deadly wounds and considerable damage. For the inhabitants of the land fell on him with such great force that he was forced to take flight and run to the sea, after many of his people had been killed. The Indians, having noticed what the Spaniards were after, and that it was to do with greed for gold and goods, scattered therefore here and there along the way many pieces of unrefined gold and certain golden necklaces. When the Spaniards then picked these up and collected them, the Indians crept out secretly from hiding, fell among them with their poisoned arrows, and brought many of them to their end. The Spaniards greatly marveled at the Indians' brave and steadfast resistance, since they thus boldly undertook to protect their freedom, by which many of the Spaniards perished. And since many also died daily from the unhealthy air, they began to complain about the governor, that he had led them to a place where in the dark, thick forests and the inconvenience of the place they could accomplish nothing, and were daily ambushed by the enemies from their hidden lurking places, and had to leave their lives shamefully. When the governor tried manifoldly to content them with friendly words, and the ship from Hispaniola had arrived to supply them, and he also cheered them with Ancesis's letter, that if he did not come back in a month, they might sail wherever they wished, he accomplished nothing thereby, and resolved finally, if the governor would not let them go, to escape in small boats and put to sea. When this was reported to the governor, so that he might settle the uprising and not be forced to leave the land in such a sorry state, he straightway stepped himself into the ship that had just newly come there, and left Franciscus to deal with matters and business in his absence. He promised besides upon the highest pledge that he would come back shortly with provisions and a reinforcement of war people from the island of Hispaniola. But if in 40 days he had not returned, the commanders and warmen might act and do whatever seemed best and most fitting. But the aforesaid Hojeda came to Hispaniola only with great difficulty and danger after a long time, and some days after his arrival, the wounds he had received, which had been burned out in the Indian manner, broke open again, and increased from day to such a degree that he became, out of grief and despair, a Franciscan monk. and finally died with great pain and lamentation, and was buried in the Cowal. Meanwhile, Franciscus Pizarro, the lieutenant, had already waited 2 whole months for the governor, and was forced by great hunger to leave the land. For which reason, he sat in 2 ships with the remaining 70 Spaniards, and sailed away. As they sailed around those boundaries seeking provisions, behold, a great wind arose at sea, so that the waves broke over the ship and drowned it together with the war people and munitions. An incredible great sea creature also struck the steering rudder, so that the ship people could no longer steer the ship, but had to trust to wind and fortune, by which it was then suddenly dragged to the bottom. By this same storm, Pizarro was thrown with the other ship onto the island of Fuerte. When he wished to take fresh water there, it was forcibly denied him by the Indians, even though he gave all signs of friendliness and peace. And since he was so thirsty and powerless, and still in the midst of the storm had to leave from there and sail around the other boundaries until he finally found a safe landing. When the storm had calmed a little and the disturbance had passed, he went out again onto the high sea and met by chance the bachelor Ancisis, together with a ship and a long barge, well stocked with provisions and war people. It was intent on coming to Hojeda's help, having heard how they were in great need, hunger, and distress. Pizarro was beyond measure greatly delighted at his arrival, and recounted with a sorrowful heart his accident, and suffered shipwreck. Among other things, he informed him how the governor Hojeda had granted permission that if he did not return in a month, they might sail wherever they wished. This was at first suspicious to Ancisis. He did not want to believe it either, but supposed they had fled from Hojeda and secretly fallen away. He said he was content, and commanded them to come back with him. And though Pizarro begged on behalf of the sick soldiers that they might be refreshed again on the island of Hispaniola, and offered to give 50 pounds of gold, he persisted in his opinion, and comforted them with friendly words that they should be of good heart. They would soon come back to their strength and good health through the fresh and new food that he would share with them. Thereupon they followed him, and not far from New Cartagena, they landed at the Camagrian shore, stepped ashore without any resistance from the Indians, and fetched fresh water and other necessary things. From there, Ancisis sailed further, and soon after came to Urubá, and there in the very place where Hojeda had gone ashore before, through the ship patron's inexperience and carelessness, his great and powerful galleon ran onto a cliff, was dashed to pieces, so that all provisions, munitions, and the horses and other animals were drowned and went to the bottom. The war people barely escaped with their bare lives and had to leave everything behind. When Ancisis had lost his ship and all provisions through this misfortune, and saw that the poor war people were sustaining themselves miserably on roots, herbs, and crab apples, the Spaniards reported this to him, and he resolved to march into the mainland, and considered it more honorable to either fall on the field through a manful battle or conquer, than that they should so shamefully perish of hunger and distress. But when he undertook this with some 100 Spaniards, and had proceeded only some 40 or 50 steps on land, an uncountable army of Indians met them, received them with their poisoned arrows, and shot at them so violently that they gave quick flight to the shore, and besides cursed the land which let out such poisoned arrows into the abyss of hell. When Ancisis's plan had failed, and he had gotten neither provisions nor been able to subdue the enemies, he was not a little troubled, since a captured Indian had indicated to him that not far from the bay in a stretch of land there lay a flat region which had an abundance of all necessary things. He set out with 100 Spaniards there. The Indians left him in peace for a while, until they saw what he was about to start. But as soon as they saw that he intended to establish a permanent seat and build houses, they seized their weapons and tried to drive the Spaniards away by force. In contrast, Ancisis also put his war people in battle order, and urged them to brave manhood. Before he launched the attack, however, he made a special vow to God. If he granted him the victory, he would build a church in his honor, to the praise and honor of the Virgin Mary. He then launched the attack, and a fierce battle rose on both sides until the Indians were finally beaten and put to flight, which then also put new heart in the Spaniards, so that they chased the enemies a long way, and all those they caught they strangled. After the victory, they also attacked this people's villages and towns, and found bread, roots, and other necessary things in abundance, with which they then refreshed themselves again. They also found afterward, but through force and torture of certain Indians, the king's treasure, some cloths, bed-sheets, earthen and wooden dishes and vessels, and more than 2,500 pesos of gold, that he had hidden in the reed bushes and swampy places. For which reason Anchises thanked God highly for the granted victory and great wealth, and established there a new city and church, which he named Antigua Darien, and with this the war men were also fully comforted. Among these matters a rebel named Vasco Núñez de Balboa, naturally a turbulent and useless man, declared that he would no longer henceforth be under Ancheses's authority, as that of a lowly and incapable, unjust judge, nor henceforth under Hojeda's compulsion and obedience. He therefore went further into the mainland with his troops out of greed for gold. During these conflicts, a certain royal king indicated to Balboa one day a sum of gold and precious stones worth 4,000 pesos, and gave him 60 bondsmen. And when in the distribution of it, roughly a quarrel and dispute arose among the Spaniards, so that they also drew weapons against each other. The king struck with his fist the scale in which the gold lay, so that it flew here and there across the floor, and said angrily thereupon, "It astonishes me greatly that you Christian people, for such a poor and paltry thing, start such a quarrel and fight, as if this thing were fit to drink, and man had to live from it alone. Since you have such a great longing and desire for such a petty metal, I will lead you to a place where your thirst and want of gold shall easily be quenched and satisfied. There must be more of them," he continued, "so that you can overcome certain powerful kings through whose land you must pass, particularly one powerful king named Tumanama, whose land is 6 sun journeys, or 6 days' travel, from here, and has a great abundance of gold, after which you are so eagerly desirous. He will without doubt come toward you. After that you must climb the mountains toward the south, on which live wild people called the Caribers, human-eaters, who have neither lord nor law, and live quietly. But when you come to the uppermost ridge of the mountains, you will see a sea, on which ships with sails travel just like yours. When you have climbed all the mountains, you will come into a land so rich in gold and pearls that gold there is as common as you say iron is among you." At this report the Spaniards were beyond measure greatly delighted, particularly Balboa and Colmenares, and could scarcely wait for the day to break, to set out. For which reason they went back at once to Antigua, mustered without delay more war people, and arranged other necessary things for the voyage. And Balboa hurried particularly so that another might not appropriate the newly found sea. To try his fortune, he set out on the 7th of September, in the year 1513, with the royal Panchiacus in a small ship and 20 Indian boats in which his allies were, with all manner of instruments for opening the way, well provided with provisions. In the course of this voyage, Balboa had overcome the royals in the province of Esquiragua and killed more than 600 Indians. He found in it the king's brother, and several others dressed in women's clothing, at which he greatly marveled, and inquired of this the reason. There he was informed that the slain king and all his court had been poisoned by the terrible sin of sodomy. At this Balboa was quite fiercely seized with anger, that this so utterly abominable vice had come even to these barbaric peoples, and commanded that all those who were in this practice, some 40 in number, should be seized and thrown to his dogs that he had brought along, so that they might be torn apart. The inhabitants were not only quite satisfied with this, since thereby the sun-worshippers would be freed, but also brought certain others, who were stained with this abominable sin, to Balboa, spat upon them, and begged him to punish them in like fashion, and cleanse the land of such godless people, all of whom he exterminated. Since, however, a part of his people, on account of the arduous journey, had become so weak and feeble that they could barely see, and then also because of the shortage of food, he took only the strongest with him, together with some guides, and directed his journey toward the mountains from which he could see the southern sea. When he was almost arrived there, he had his people stand still and climbed alone to the height of the mountain, from where he could see all the surrounding places. And when he turned his eyes toward the south, he saw the sea. He immediately fell quickly on his knees, and thanked God that he had, though of his lowly and common origin, granted him the grace and willed that he should be the first among Christian people to bring away the fame of so praiseworthy an achievement. After he had kissed the earth 3 times, and greeted the sea with many words as the queen among the other seas, he beckoned his companions to come up to him and see this, who were no less glad than if each one had won a kingdom. They all ran up together in competition, and cried for joy so loudly that it echoed in the stony rivers and steepest mountains all around. Thereafter they carried for remembrance, as those who had been the first to disclose this sea, two great stone heaps on top of the mountain, and stuck in the middle between them a great cross. Afterwards, as they came down, they cut in the bark of the trees the name of Castile and of the king in Spain, taking title and possession of this land in his name. From there Balboa ranged through various places of this province, always with fortunate progress, and often under the guise of justice punished the Indians severely, so that he could frighten gold and money from them. Finally he returned to Antigua Darien with an uncountable sum of gold and precious stones. There, on account of the new sea, he held a common prayer, and the Spanish inhabitants came toward him with a great procession and ceremony, and received him. After this Balboa sent a ship from Antigua to Spain, and wrote to the king the progress of all his actions and the present state, how the matters stood. Likewise that he had discovered the Southern Sea, and humbly petitioned his royal majesty, thereby to appoint him governor over it and to send him 1,000 well-equipped soldiers, so that he might govern and hold these peoples more easily in check. He also promised that in a short time he would bring together an unbelievable sum of gold and goods and send it to the royal treasury. The king received these great gifts and the fifth share of the found riches with great joy, and when he understood from it that Balboa had found the Southern Sea, which was rich beyond measure in gold and pearls, he revoked the verdict that had been pronounced against him, forgave him all his misdeeds committed against Encisos, and appointed him governor over the Southern Sea, and in accordance with his request sent him 1,000 well-equipped Spaniards as a reinforcement, so that he might hold these seas the more easily in check and govern them. For the province of Antigua Darien he appointed Petrus Arias de Avila as governor, an experienced fighter, and set as bishop there Friar Juan Cabete of the Franciscan order and royal court preacher. And besides, he expressly commanded the governor that he should deal mercifully with the Indians. Above all, give them peace first, and not force them to friendship with violence and weapons. In the end, he bound him to follow Nikis's and Hojeda's command and order, and in all things to share the newly found goods with the priests and monks who had gone there, to bring the people to the Christian faith. In obedience to this command, Petrus Arias sailed in the year 1514 from the seaport of Santa Maria with 4 powerful ships and 12 caravels, in which 1,500 men were, and sailed straight to Antigua. When he had landed there, Balboa came to meet him with all his friends and war people, received him in the highest friendliness, led him into his house and housed him, and showed him the character and state of the province. When the governor had heard this from him, he was greatly pleased that the greater part among the Indians in this province loved and honored the Spanish friendship and alliance. He therefore immediately, in the district of Tumanama, began to have houses built and a fortress erected. But then he sent Johann Costa with 40 Spaniards and 2 caravels into the neighboring region of Uraga, there to seek gold and pearls and to extort them from the people by force. When he did not find as great a sum as he desired, he took all the captured royals and began to torture and rack them miserably, so that they should indicate to him where they had hidden their treasures and jewels. He also did not spare Pontiacus's subjects, but oppressed them exceedingly with robbery and burden, so that he so embittered and moved the spirit and friendship of Pontiacus, as dear and precious as they had previously been to him, that he became afterward the opposite, and not without reason, for the one who had previously done them all good they repaid with evil. Finally, when he had thrown a great number of Pontiacus's subjects against the stones to death, the Indians grew so enraged against the Spaniards that they ran together and cried with a terrible shout, "The godless, vicious, shameful, and cowardly Christians must die, for they are not worthy that the earth carries them." And they immediately also killed many Spaniards. Their captain Johann Costa fled with the remaining war people and the dishonorable loot in a caravel back to Antigua. The governor was not upset by this, but sent out yet more other captains and warmen in various places of these boundaries, and among others Bartholomeus Hurtado into the region of Aklam, who there, under the guise of peace and friendship, seized all the Indians he could find, led them away captive, and sold them as bondsmen. The Indians' infinite tyranny also caused the Indians to deal quite terribly with their captives. For as many as they took alive, particularly, however, the commanders and officers, they bound hands and feet, threw them down on the earth, poured molten gold with a funnel into their mouths, and quenched their insatiable greed with such words, "Eat, you insatiable Christian." And for greater torture and shame, they cut some at the feet, some at the arms, some at the shoulders, some at the legs, and laid them on grills, and ate them with great rejoicing, singing, jumping, and dancing. The bones and bodies, however, they hung in their heathen temples, or in their royal houses, as if to a remembrance and victory sign. A brief summary of the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, and how he discovered the Strait, now called the Magellan Sea and Strait after him, and thereafter we shall proceed further with the Indian matters in the mainland provinces. Ferdinand Magellan, a noble Portuguese, after he had for a long time had the command of the royal public ships in Barbary and in the Moorish land, and rendered faithful services to his king. When he came back to Portugal, he most humbly requested that his appointment be improved by a half ducat's worth per month, in compensation and recompense of the toil and labor he had expended on the king's business. This the king refused him, so that others would not similarly desire the same from him. Through this refusal, Magellan was so enraged that he resolved to take account of the king for it, and the following opportunity presented itself to him. He had at that time in the Moluccas Islands, from which the spices are brought, a kinsman named Franciscus Serranus, out of Portugal, a commander and war captain of the king of the island of Ternate. This man wrote to him repeatedly that if he could arrange it, he should travel to him. Magellan did not let such a wished-for opportunity go unused, but resolved, if any potentate would bear the costs, to whom he would show an agreeable service in this, and conduct himself thankfully toward him, to sail to the Moluccas by a different route than toward the sunrise, as the Portuguese had hitherto been accustomed to travel, and thereby to steal this profit of the trading from the King of Portugal. He therefore went on his way to Castile, went to Cardinal Francisco Jimenez, who governed the whole kingdom in the absence of Charles, and explained to him and to the good presidents of the Indian Parliament that the Molucca Islands, which lie beyond Calcutta, Malacca, and other places, furthest out from the Indies toward the morning, belong to the Castilians, and that King Emmanuel of Portugal holds them with an unjust title, contrary to and against the treaty established between both nations. To prove this, he took as a witness and companion Rui Falero, who was excellently skilled in cosmography and astronomy. They then laid this before King Charles, who afterwards became emperor of the same name, the Fifth, and pointed out that it was unnecessary to travel the long route past the Cape of Good Hope, but he hoped that if one sailed toward the west, a sea would be found in the western Indies, through which one could reach the southern sea, and from there sail to the Molucca Islands. By this route one could bring spices and other goods of the Orient into the land more conveniently and with less cost than via the Portuguese route. King Charles heard this quite favorably, and on the advice of the presidents of the Indian Parliament, had 5 ships fitted out at his cost, and made Magellan supreme patron over them. He sailed with his subordinate people on the 10th of August, in the year 1519, from Seville, and after some months came to the Canary Islands, sailing past the sea borders of the province of Brazil, and when they had come to the 49.5 degree beyond the equinoctial circle toward the southern pole, they cast anchor and lay still for 5 months. There they saw at the shore only one giant, who was so tall that the Spaniards barely reached his belt. Later they also caught another, who ate a whole basket of twice-baked bread at once, and drank half a barrel of water in one breath. Magellan afterwards named this province Patagonia, because the giants he had seen there wore the hides of wild animals on their feet in the manner of shoes, so that they looked more like bears' or other animals' feet than human feet. At this place, which they stayed at for 5 months, and named the harbor of Port St. Julian, a mutiny arose. He sailed further on toward the south, roughly 20 Italian miles, to the elevation of the 42nd degree of the southern pole's point, and finally found a sea which was 110 Italian miles long within itself, and 2 miles wide, and in some places more, surrounded on both sides by high mountains, and reaching through to the other sea, which is called the Still and Peaceful Sea. And this is the sea which Magellan first discovered, and for that reason is called the Magellan Sea, where others had held it only for a bay. It is also called the Sea of Victoria, since the ship in which they first took notice of this sea was named Victoria, and which later also completed the circumnavigation of the world. Into this still and peaceful sea they came on the 28th of November in the year 1520, and sailed 3 months and 20 days, 400 Italian miles, before they saw land. During this time, they consumed the ship's bread and other provisions, and at the place where it lay, gathered up the crumbs along with the dust and worms, of which many were in it, and ate it, although it smelled altogether of mice nests. Their water had become so spoiled and yellow that every time they drank they had to hold their eyes and noses shut. So great a hunger resulted that they cooked and ate the leather belts, shoes, boots, every jacket, and even the leather with which the shields were covered. And they did not spare the leather on the yards either, though it was quite hardened by sun, wind, and rain, but soaked it in sea-water for 3 whole days until it became soft, and then ate it. For some the gum flesh was so swollen that they could not even see their longest teeth, and they could not eat either. 19 died from it. Some fell into such great weakness that they could move neither hands nor feet. In this Magellanic Sea they encountered in the aforesaid time 2 desolate islands 200 Italian miles apart, but saw in them nothing but trees and birds, and named them the Unlucky Islands. Finally, when they had passed over the equinoctial heavenly circle, they fell among islands, which they called the primary sea of St. Lazarus, in some of which they went ashore. Among others, on the island of Zubut and Marin, this brave sea captain was killed by the Indians together with some Spaniards in the year 1521, before he could bring into effect what he had intended. His other companions, however, sailed further on, and came to the Molucca Islands, loaded there with spices, and when they wished to depart from there, they agreed that of the remaining ships, the Victoria, which was least damaged, should sail back to Spain via the Portuguese route, while the other ship, in which the fresh water was carried, should travel into the Portuguese India, so that it might come to Panama or some other border of Hispaniola. Those who took their way back to Spain departed from the Molucca Islands at the end of December, in the year 1521, and after they had sailed past many islands and along the right-hand side of all the eastern Indian sea borders, letting Hormuz lie on the left, they set their course on the great Cape of Bonespez, the Cape of Good Hope, against whose contrary winds they spent 7 weeks. And they finally arrived on the 7th of September in the year 1522, in Spain, in the harbor called Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and were of them only 18 persons remaining, out of the 59 who had set out from the Molucca Islands. After careful calculation and reckoning, having now sailed the whole circuit from the sunrise to the sunset, they found that they had covered the circuit of the whole earth in the number of miles. For that reason, the supreme ship captain of the ship Victoria, Juan Sebastian de Elcano, had in his coat of arms the earth's globe carried, with this motto, Primus circumdedisti me, that is, Thou hast first gone around me. On the 8th day of the month of September they came to Seville, and after all guns had fired shots of rejoicing, they walked, barefoot, wearing nothing more than their linen undergarments, carrying burning torches in their hands, into the great cathedral church of the city, to give thanks to God, through whose goodness they had accomplished such a great voyage. What afterwards Lord Francis Drake and others accomplished in an equivalent voyage shall also follow at its place. We now want to return to the Middle Indian histories, for after this time many governors and captains were sent into the Indian mainland provinces, who were drawn there out of desire and longing for great wealth. Of those, however, the greater part were eaten by the Indians. Many, however, also killed by the Spaniards themselves, who would not permit them their willfulness and desire, with robbing and stealing, together with other shameful misdeeds against the Indians. Not a few of them also drowned in the sea and other waters. Others, who out of greed for gold had ventured too far from the sea onto the mainland, sometimes got into pathless places and great wildernesses, and could get no further either backward or forward, and had to perish miserably with their whole war force from hunger and thirst. Introduction. A note on this volume. This closes Batch 4 of Part 3. The narrative has now moved through Columbus, 4 voyages, Vespucci, 2 voyages, the Indian servitude debates, the careers of Hojeda, Pizarro, and Balboa, and Magellan's complete circumnavigation. The Victoria arrives in Seville. The crew walks barefoot to the cathedral. 18 men out of 59. Future sessions will continue with the remaining voyage accounts in Book 2. Drake, Raleigh, Hans Staden, Ulrich Schmidl, the Dutch West India Company, and Willem Schouten discovering Cape Horn.